So it's with great joy that we welcome him here. His topic today, after Gaza, what now for Israeli-Palestinian relations? It's my great honor to introduce my friend, and we're hoping to be a colleague here at the University of Arizona in some way, somehow will make happen, Dr. Khalil Shikaki. Welcome.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with you. The topic today on the Gaza War and its aftermath is a topic that one can cover in various ways. As you can see, my focus is on the political dimension, how the war might affect the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations. I have talked in the past couple of months about a lot of other dimensions of this war that I'm not going to talk about today. I'd be very happy to answer questions about it. There is the humanitarian side of this that I unfortunately will not have time to address. There are some very important ethical questions about the war that I also unfortunately will not be able to address. The question of the closure and the siege on Gaza is a sensitive topic. The issue of the targeting of civilians and the use of civilian areas to launch rockets is also a very important ethical question that I'm not going to address. So I'm listing the things I won't be talking about, and before getting into what I want to talk about, and the issue of how Israel manages its relationship with Hamas, of course, has a very important political and strategic dimension that I will get into, but I will not get into the ethical dimension of that issue. Again, if I get time and some of you have interest in those issues, I'd be happy to address them. But my focus is entirely on how, from this point on, the war might affect Israeli-Palestinian relations. And the issues that I want to address are three. One, what is the likelihood that the war will provide impetus for violence? That is, Israeli-Palestinian violence. To what extent the war has created an environment that would be conducive to a greater violence in Israeli-Palestinian relations. The second question that I'd like to address will be on the question of negotiations. To what extent the war had affected the calculations of the parties, the Palestinian and the Israeli parties, on the substance of negotiations. Most importantly, I will focus on the issue of security and the positions of the two parties on the question of security. And the third question that I intend to focus on is on the most likely interaction that Palestinians and Israelis might have at the diplomatic front. Essentially, where will the Palestinians go from here, other than violence, other than sitting at the table? What a third alternative might be open to the Palestinians, and how that might affect Israeli-Palestinian relations. This third issue is essentially the question of the turn to the UN and the attempt by the Palestinians to wage a diplomatic warfare against Israel in international organizations. Okay, so let me go back then to the issues that I want to address, and those have to do with the likely impact of the war on the three questions: the violence, the negotiations, and the most likely course of action Palestinians and Israelis are likely to take in the next few weeks and months. A lot of the drivers of Palestinian behavior with regard to how Palestinians will address or will influence this relationship on the three questions has to do with the nature of the domestic environment on the Palestinian side. I'm a strong believer on the role of domestic politics in affecting Israeli-Palestinian relations. The Americans like to think that they are the most important driver in international politics. And a lot of people think individual leaders are really what are the most important drivers. I tend to, without discounting these two very important drivers, I tend to focus on domestic politics. A lot of people ignore domestic politics when looking at issues of war and peace. And I think it's, on the Palestinian side, I tend to believe that it would be a mistake. And on the Israeli side, I had mentioned the surveys that I have been doing among Palestinians for more than 20 years. Since 2000, these surveys were conducted jointly with the Hebrew University. So we not only ask Palestinians about these issues, but we also ask the Israelis, in many cases, identical questions about these issues, and I can, and I am certain that on the Israeli side of this equation, domestic Israeli factors are as important as Palestinian domestic factors. So what are the factors, domestic factors on the Palestinian side that are the drivers that and will affect the questions we're looking at? That is the three issues that I have raised. The slides that I'm going to show you are 3, 4. And they will show you some of the changes. Some of those changes that have happened in the domestic environment are actually dramatic changes, and they occurred as a result of the war. And there are three in particular that I'm going to focus on. And all three address issues that were surveyed immediately after the end of the war. In fact, we were collecting data. We were in the field during the last day of the war, and this was, in other words, about a month, 2 months ago or so. And then we did another survey a month later. And I will show you the change from the before the war, immediately after the war, and a month later after the war. So we will see, first of all, the changes that the war introduced, but also how a month later those changes did not dissipate, but diminished in importance. Why is this important? Well, this is not the first Palestinian-Israeli war or Hamas-Israel war. We had 2 previous wars before that. And the surveys we've of course been conducting these surveys during those periods, and the findings are essentially the same. We have the same trends. And the 3 slides that we will see will show you how the war affects the domestic balance of power, how it affects the attitude regarding whose vision, whose way is the best way for Palestinians. Is it Hamas's way with the violence, or is it Abbas's way with diplomacy, whether it is through negotiations or the use of international organizations? Which way the Palestinians believe is the best way to go? If it is violence, they would support a 3rd intifada, for example. If it is diplomacy, they would oppose resumption of violence. And the third change is in the attitudes of the public, is in their willingness to compromise. To what extent Palestinian public opinion would support say Abbas, the Palestinian president, in making concessions. Now, So these three issues about public opinion affect the domestic setup, right? The war is an external effect, and it triggers dramatic consequences immediately. And then, a month later, in this case, this is the first time that we actually did two surveys, one after the other, with a 1 month difference. And we're doing a survey in early December. This would be about 3 months after the end of the war or so. So we will be able to track the changes after short intervals. In previous times, we've seen the same trends that we will see in a minute. The changes in the domestic balance of power, the changes with regard to the role of violence, and the changes with regard to compromise. But we have never seen the magnitude of the change that you will see in a minute that the war has triggered. There's a second feature that we have seen in previous wars. The changes that the wars introduce in the domestic environment dissipate 3 to 6 months later. So the impact of the war tends to be temporary. This time, the changes, and you'll see in a minute that in fact this proves to be the case this time as well. Now, this is not to underestimate the importance of the changes. They are significant changes, and as I said, this time, in fact, they are dramatic in terms of their magnitude. The size of the change is significant. But to say that we shouldn't consider them as a permanent feature of the Palestinian domestic scene, they are likely to change. And what direction they will change will depend on what happens. So if things change later on and they revert back to where they were before, what is the importance of studying the impact of the war? Well, there is the larger question of what kind of role violence plays in shaping the Palestinian psyche. In what direction the war pushes Palestinians. And in understanding that, it helps us evaluate the role of wars in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Let me show you the first chart. This chart tells us that, and this chart actually goes back to 2006. This is about the domestic balance of power. And the domestic balance of power is captured here in the question to what happens if there is elections tomorrow and presidential elections. And you have the current president Mahmoud Abbas running against the most popular Hamas leader. He is Ismail Haniyeh. He was the Hamas's prime minister between 2006 and early this year. So what you see in blue is Abbas, the figures for Abbas. And as you can see, and these surveys started immediately after the elections. In 2006, the Palestinian elections, Hamas won those elections. At the popular level, I think the second slide will show that as well. At the popular level, Hamas received the support of 44% of the popular vote. Fatah, the nationalist movement, headed by Abbas, won the support of 41% of the popular vote. This, of course, has no relationship to the distribution of seats. The Palestinian electoral system is a little complicated, and it, even though the nationalists, that is Fatah, the mainstream Fatah, and about another 7 nationalist political parties competing in the elections together, Fatah and the other nationalists won 56% of the popular vote. They actually won only 40% or so of the seats. Don't ask me now to explain how that happened, but it's just a complicated electoral system. And there are reasons why this system has punished the nationalists, and it has to do with their fragmentation, essentially. So, but immediately after those elections, we can see that in the blue color shows throughout this period, with two exceptions, actually three exceptions. The first one, where there is a dip, you can see the dip in the blue color. Well, this dip came after the first war that Israel had with Hamas. And then the second dip, where actually the second dip was more serious. You can see the second dip that actually Abbas lost. In the first dip, Abbas didn't lose, but he went down. In the second one, he actually lost to Haniya. Okay, now look at the third dip. This is the one that we documented 2 months ago, in August. And as you can see, the dip was huge, dramatic. And look at the spike. The spike, the first time, there is a spike, but it's not as huge as it is in the second or the third time around. The third time around, the spike is fascinating. It is absolutely incredible, where Haniya easily defeats Abbas. And if you look to where were things before the war, in fact, things before the war were pointing in a different direction. Abbas was actually moving forward. He was gaining. Hamas was actually losing. And then all of a sudden, boom, you have Abbas going down to 32%. And Haniya moving beyond the 60% point. 60% is simply unprecedented in the history of surveys we have conducted. We have never seen an Islamist leader winning such grand majority. As I indicated earlier, when Hamas won the elections in 2006, this was Hamas's greatest achievement. It won by 44% of the popular vote. Okay, so the point that this makes is that Abbas, if there is indeed a single loser in this war, it would be Abbas. Netanyahu actually did very well in the Israeli scene after the war. There was some criticism of him, but he certainly didn't come out loser, even if he didn't win much, but he didn't lose. Haniya came out a winner, certainly, and so Abbas was certainly the biggest loser. So wars are good for some people, they're bad for other people. They're good for Hamas's leaders, they're bad for the nationalist leaders. It's important to think about this because we will look at the whole package of the domestic change. And keep in mind that we're doing this in order to understand what will happen in the three questions with regard to Israeli-Palestinian relations. This is one of those. This is another one. This is about, we really want to know how deep. It's not just Abbas versus Haniya. It's not just a matter of the personalities. We're trying to see if beyond that, the political parties themselves, the people are shifting loyalty altogether, not to an individual, but to a political party. A political party has agenda, values, political positions. That's even more serious than the first one. And so what is the trend here? Well, as you can see, we actually didn't register much of a change as the result of the first Hamas-Israel war on this issue. There was a little bit of decline, one must admit, but Hamas actually didn't really benefit much. It slowed down again, the colors, by the way, the blue refers to Fatah and the red to Hamas. The second war was more dramatic, where you can see there's a spike and a dip. Well, that's the second Israel-Hamas war. But now look at the third war. The third war, as you can see, the spike and the dip are indeed dramatic. Okay, so there is no doubt that the domestic balance of power is extremely sensitive to issues of war and violence. That's the bad news. The good news is it's really temporary. Temporary, as you can see, a month later, when we went back a month later, things, the increase that we saw, the spike and the dip, were modified. Fatah gained a little bit, Hamas went down a little bit. The same thing happened with Abbas and Haniya. Haniya still wins, even a month later. I'm waiting to see what results we will get in December. But there is no doubt that what we saw in the past, after the previous wars, which you can see here. You can see here what happens after the previous wars. And then things stabilize and go back to where they were before, where more domestic issues become more important in shaping the balance of power. So we have an environment in which domestic issues, very serious domestic issues, shape the domestic balance of power. Issues related to corruption, issues related to how much democracy there is among Palestinians, issues related to the extent to which Hamas is seen by the public as threatening national unity. When Hamas used violence, for example, against Abbas, the popularity of Hamas went down. When Hamas was unable to pay the public sector because of the positions it took on the peace process, the public sector abandoned Hamas. Although the public sector voted for Hamas in 2006 because of the corruption, the public sector was actually the most important sector that was affected by the issue of corruption, and it voted significantly more than the general public in favor of Hamas because of that. But it was the first group that abandoned Hamas after Hamas formed this government because Hamas was unable to pay the public sector. When Hamas tried, starting in 2007, to impose Islamization on society, limit freedoms of women and youth by various means, Hamas lost popular support. So you had all these internal, domestic issues about Hamas and Fatah and the competition between the two, and then a war intrudes on the picture. Without a war, the domestic environment since 2006 has been consistently moving in the direction where Hamas loses and the nationalists gain. There's absolutely no doubt that the nationalists are not gaining significantly, but they're certainly gaining, and Hamas is certainly losing. And it had absolutely nothing to do with Israel, and it has more to do with the domestic environment. When the war intrudes into this picture, it simply reverses. It reverses the impact of the domestic environment. And we go back to a situation where Hamas gains greater capacity to influence the environment. A second domestic impact is the question. There's a question that there are several questions. I've just selected this question because it also it shows the dramatic change and the leveling down soon after. But there are other questions where we measure this issue. And the most important aspect isn't really just to know whether people support violence or not. It's the question of why they support it. Is it because they have bought into Hamas's vision? So we ask them, whose vision are you find yourself supporting? Is it Hamas and the armed resistance? Or is it Abbas and the diplomacy, whether negotiations or the UN? This is a regular question that we have been asking for several years now. And we've asked the question immediately after the war and a month later after the war, and it basically points in this direction, what you see here. More and more people, the war has affected the psyche, the public psyche, on what is the best course of action that we Palestinians should take. Should we continue to engage Israel in diplomacy, or should we engage Israel in violence? And you can see that between March and August, and in fact, although I'm using the March data here, the same data was also in June. So the increase from 43%, as you can see here, to 60% is certainly dramatic. This is almost 50% increase in the level of support for violence. But then you lose about 1/6 of that, or a little more than that, a month later. So part of the response to what course of action we should take is emotional. It is the response to the pain and suffering. And the response is not to make people less willing to support violence, but more willing to support violence. So that's another lesson from the war. In fact, I could have also shown you, by the way, the same trend after the previous two wars, as I did here. That is, the Palestinian public responds to violence by demanding violence against the Israelis. The wars immediately increased Palestinian threat perception, and the more increased the threat perception, the more willing the public becomes to support violence. This is not unique to the Palestinians, by the way. The same surveys that we conduct among Israelis show similar trends. When people are threatened, they tend to want to punish the other side or to deter the other side. And so they tend to escalate their own violence. There is a change in the domestic balance of power. There is a change in embracing Hamas's way forward. Support for violence, intifada is one way of doing it, and the willing to compromise. The question that we usually select as the most sensitive is the support for the two-state solution. To what extent people support the creation of two states, Israel, Palestine, living in peace, security, and cooperation. This is a question. The reason we use this is because we have data, actually, that goes back 20 years. So 20 years of data tells us the story of what happens to the Palestinian position on this issue. So what was the impact of the war, before and after? Well, before the war, the figure that we had in June was 54% saying yes to a two-state solution. By the way, and I'll show the charts this evening, up until 2011, in fact, the level of support for that was close to 70%. So between 2011 and 2014, we've actually lost significant public support. The two-state solution lost significant public support. I must say, people who have abandoned the two-state solution, including in this survey, the immediate impact of the war is that we lost the majority in favor of a two-state solution. And a month later, we still lost it, but support went up. Actually, sorry, we regained it. We regained the support, but it didn't go back to the level it was before the war. Again, if the previous trends prove applicable to this time, we will see public support going back. Where do people go? People who previously, yesterday, were in favor of a two-state solution and now say they are opposed to the two-state solution. Where do they go? Well, most of the time, they go to what might be called a one-state solution. This is particularly true for the youth. More and more Palestinian youth are in favor of a one-state, one-man, one vote. For the Palestinian youth, particularly for the educated youth. The educated youth seem to have concluded that the two-state solution is no longer practical and that the reality on the ground is one state. In their mind, there is no if or buts about it. In my home, my son argues with me all the time, what two-state solution are you talking about? There is no two-state solution. What we have is what we will always have. This is a one-state reality on the ground. That's what we will always have. And the question is, can we make this reality more equitable? Can we ensure that we are treated equally as Palestinians in this equation? And that's why the one man, one vote. I'm still traditional nationalist. He would not consider himself traditional nationalist. He would consider himself as someone who transcends nationalism. And for him, a one man, one vote, whether you're Jewish or Palestinian or Arab, doesn't matter. All we want is equal political rights. A majority of Palestinians does not support that. In fact, the overwhelming majority does not support that. You can say that 3-1 Palestinians say no to a one-state solution. But the fact that people abandoning the two-state solution move to supporting one-state solution and that it is focused among the youth and the educated tells us about where this trajectory might be going and that the future will probably keep moving in that direction. Okay. So we have these three changes that the surveys demonstrate time after time. 3 wars, the same basic trends. Wars, therefore, have that, let's not necessarily call it war, violence, because we've seen the impact of violence throughout the Second Intifada as well. Violence has that kind of effect. Hamas, before the Second Intifada, in our surveys, didn't have much support, 15%, maybe 20% at best. By 2004, in fact, started in 2003, Hamas was beating Fatah in the surveys. What happened? The violence, again. So violence has indeed significant dramatic effects on the Palestinians. It affects the balance of power. It affects their way of viewing what works, what is the best way to go forward, and it affects their willingness to pay a price for peace. On the question of, therefore, what happens in Israeli-Palestinian relations, is it going to be more or less violent? I would say that given the combination of changes, it looks like there will be more violence. Why do I say that? Well, I've shown you what happens with the general public. What I didn't show you, and I could have shown you, didn't want to bother you with all the details of the findings, is that a significant part of Fatah supporters, those who support Abbas, have actually abandoned Fatah, abandoned Abbas, abandoned their approach, and are supporting violence. The most dramatic change is not in Hamas' base. Hamas's base didn't change. The change that led to all of this is actually in Fatah's base. Why did I say Abbas was the biggest loser? Well, because it is his base. In fact, to say the public at large moved in this is not the most accurate way of describing it. What happens here is that this mainstream nationalist base abandons Abbas, abandons Fatah, embraces violence as the best way to move forward, and reject compromise. So if this Fatah base continues to go in the direction that we see, war after war, and as you can see, the last war had indeed the most dramatic effect. Imagine what the next war will do. The trend, therefore, is towards greater likelihood of violence, and the perpetrators of the violence are likely to come now from Fatah. It is these people who have a great deal of discontent with the Palestinian Authority for various reasons, domestic and otherwise, discontent with Abbas and what they see Abbas's failures, that are leading the change. And they are, if one looks at who is leading the current disturbances in the West Bank, most importantly in Jerusalem. The Israeli media sometimes reports on this, and most of the time they seem to assume that it's Hamas that is leading the escalation. In fact, it isn't Hamas. Hamas has actually, in the West Bank, is today much weaker than it has been at any time. Hamas's capacity to wage such violence is actually greatly constrained by things the Palestinian Authority is doing in the West Bank and things the Israelis are doing. Most of the violence that we see today and the escalation in the violence is actually organized by these discontented Fatah activists who now despise Abbas, despise the PA, and many of whom would like to see the PA dissolved. How does the war affect the negotiations? My second question. One thing that the Israelis, this is where I look at what Israeli leaders have said. One thing that the Israeli leaders have focused on, either to justify current positions or to justify changes that they would like to introduce to their negotiating position, is that the view, this is the Israeli narrative now, of the implications of the Gaza war, is that if Hamas in Gaza is able to use these rockets to disrupt life in Israel, to close down the Israeli airport, the only airport Israel has for international travel, for 36 hours. The airport was closed down. If that can happen from Gaza, imagine what could happen if something similar is to be developed in the West Bank. Well, the airport will be permanently closed for a long time, at least. So, and those in the West Bank who might have this capacity do not need to smuggle rockets from Iran, or they can just produce locally made, much more primitive means of delivering explosives to the airport vicinity. So what is your conclusion, Mr. Netanyahu? Netanyahu said, we cannot contemplate withdrawing our armed forces from the West Bank, not just from the Jordan Valley, during the negotiations up until March of this year, when the Americans were leading the negotiations. The Israeli position was that Israel should have military presence in the Jordan Valley for a long period of time. There is talk about 100 years, talk about 20 years. So this long-term Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley was the position that Israel took. Now the defense minister and the prime minister say we have to have presence throughout the West Bank. the idea of a two-state solution coming out of negotiations based on this, of course, would be delusional. There is no way that Palestinians would ever agree to a Palestinian state that is not sovereign, a state that is fully still occupied by the Israeli army. What happens then to Palestinian-Israeli relations? If negotiations are not the answer, and if violence is likely to erupt in the foreseeable future, what happens now? What is likely to happen between Palestinians and Israelis? My conclusion is, given Abbas's considerable loss of popular support, given the extreme change with regard to how people look at his strategy compared to Hamas's, Abbas's room for maneuver is becoming smaller and smaller. I see Abbas having no alternative but to move forward with his current campaign to delegitimize the Israeli occupation through international organizations. I think Abbas has been gradually pushed in this direction. I have known Abbas for a very long period of time, and I don't think 5 years ago, he would even consider something like this. 10 years ago, he would say, "Are you crazy? We can't do something like this." This is exactly what he's doing today. And I think he's doing it, one, because he is losing legitimacy. He has lost considerable legitimacy because his term in office has ended a long time ago, and he hasn't been able to return to negotiations, to elections, to renew his legitimacy. Fatah is being weakened by both. It has lost the public support. Its base is fragmenting, moving away from it. But as importantly, even those who still say they favor Fatah are moving to a completely different way of dealing with the Israeli occupation. And therefore he's losing those as well. His only way of regaining some support and legitimacy is by challenging Israel in the international arena, including going to the International Criminal Court to try Israeli officials for war crimes, such as settlements, perhaps other things as well. Now, doing that means both Congress and the Israeli government will immediately freeze financial transfer, whether it is assistance from the US or the Palestinian money that Israel transfers to the Palestinian Authority, the custom duties and the like. If that happens, and in my view this is the most likely scenario, the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to remain as a credible government with control over security services diminishes by the day. Eventually it could collapse. 6 months ago, actually more than 6 months ago, we established a team at my center in Ramallah to look at what we call the day after. We've assumed a similar scenario like the one that is evolving in front of us now. And we put together a team of experts on the Palestinian side in the various sectors. We wanted to know what happens if and when the moment comes and the Palestinian Authority either decides to dissolve itself or collapses for a scenario similar to what I've just described. And the picture that has been depicted by the experts is horrifying. This is in part why public opinion is actually opposed to dissolving the PA. But what in this scenario, we're not talking about the PA being dissolved. It's about the PA being collapsed as a result of steps that Israel and the US Congress might take to punish the Palestinian Authority for going in a direction that I think Abbas at the moment has no alternative but to go into, due to the fact that he has lost legitimacy, he has lost public support, and that he has lost his own political party, and that the grassroots support is now moving in the direction of a confrontation. And he has either to confront that in the street using his security services, and if he does, in my view, he will lose even further support and confidence from the public. All right. I hate to leave you on this note. So I don't think this is inevitable. I think it is likely, but I don't think it is inevitable that we have to go in this direction. And I will go back to the issue of negotiations and to the efforts by the Secretary of State. I think if the Secretary of State and the Obama administration decide to attempt once again to bring the parties together, this time, however, by putting out ideas on how to resolve it, giving the Palestinians and the Israelis a roadmap for how it ends, what ultimately both communities gain by returning to negotiations. To do this, they would have to confront Palestinian, but most importantly, Israeli objection. The right wing in Israel will not agree to any deal that the left or the center in Israel will agree to. And so that requires a lot of courage on the part of the US administration. At the moment, I don't think the US administration has that kind of courage, so I don't think it's likely. But that is, I believe, is one way to prevent the earlier scenario I described from taking place. Thank you very much.